Indiana Matters Environmental Change is a co-production of Indiana University Office of the Vice Provost for Research, Indiana University Media School, and WTIU, with funding by the Herald Times featuring full newspaper pages in an e-edition, available every day at heraldtimesonline.com and on your mobile device.
The storm clouds on the horizon are a warning of what's to come. Environmental change threatens to wreak havoc with our world in the form of stronger storms, heavier rains, intensified hurricanes, rising waters, and health threats. As debate swirls on what must be done, many people are left unconvinced, while others are simply paralyzed, thinking a turnaround is unreachable. What are the threats in Indiana, and how are we responding? Coming up, a look at some of the top environmental issues in our state and the thoughts from experts on what can be done. It's all next on Indiana Matters. Hello and welcome to Indiana Matters. I'm Bruce Kopp. There is great debate on the subject of environmental change. While there are many skeptics who doubt the severity of some of the predictions, more people are expressing their serious concern. Polling results show more of us are increasingly alarmed about the rate of change. One nationwide poll finds that nearly 3 out of 4 of us are somewhat worried, and nearly 30% are very worried. Well, our hope and intent here on Indiana Matters is that this program reflects your concerns along with the issues and questions that are on your mind. We'll have questions as well from those in our studio audience. Thanks for all being here today. And over the next hour, you will hear from 4 experts in the field of environmental change in Indiana. We'll talk about efforts to help us better understand the threat, how more of us are taking the issue to heart, and we'll take a closer look at some of the environmental issues here at home. Now, more from our guests in just a moment, but first, a look at how far we've come in dealing with the issue of environmental change. The growing number of wind farms and solar panels going up across Indiana are a sign of progress in countering the effects of environmental warming. Indiana has long depended on coal-fired power plants to generate electricity, but it comes with tremendous costs due to the resulting air pollution and effects on global warming. Coal emissions combined with car exhaust and other human activity give rise to heat-trapping gases that collect in the atmosphere and act like a blanket, warming the Earth's surface. As a result, scientists say temperatures worldwide are rising, sea levels are up. There is the growing threat of heat waves, drought, heavy rainfall, flooding, and intensified natural disasters. Left unchecked, climate change could lead to profound consequences for humans and nature. Indiana has been home to those leading the effort to understand and deal with environmental change. Elinor Ostrom became the first woman to receive the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences.
Elinor Ostrom was a force of nature and a force for nature.
Ostrom and her husband Vincent carried out research around the world which would change how people think about protecting our shared resources.
She viewed the Earth as a commons, and it's the biggest commons in her way of thinking. And so climate change is the biggest issue of the commons ever.
She contended that individuals and communities could effectively manage their own collective resources, such as fisheries, forests, and water supplies, without the intrusion of government regulation or private industry.
She would find, hotspots of cooperation or collaboration and build on those. And don't worry about the outside forces that you can't control right now.
Among others focused on our environment, Linton Caldwell is described as an environmental visionary, recognized as the architect of the National Environmental Policy Act. Ron Heitz has published half a dozen books and hundreds of scientific papers analyzing chemical threats to our environment. And former Indiana Congressman Jim Johnts has been hailed as one of the greatest leaders of the modern environmental movement. There are many others, but for those who worked with Nobel Prize winner Elinor Ostrom, her work continues to motivate researchers.
Lynn always said, the reason you try to answer questions is not to get the answer, it's trying to get to better questions, more deeper, more important questions.
But will the work underway be enough? Clearly more must be done to reduce emissions and the effects of global warming. Solar panels and wind farms aren't enough. The biggest question may be, how much more can be done before it's too late? And that is one of the many questions we'll be looking to answer here today. Now, joining us to talk more about what's being done to address the challenges and work ahead in dealing with environmental change are 4 experts, professors, scholars, and researchers in the field. With us are Professor Shaheen Atari, Associate Professor with the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. Her research is focused on how people think about conservation and energy use. Jim Poyser has devoted his time to educating audiences on the environment. He is Executive Director of Earth Charter Indiana. Janet McCabe is with us. She is a former assistant administrator with the Environmental Protection Agency, a law professor at the McKinney School of Law, and is also an assistant director with the Environmental Resilience Institute. And Professor Pierre Jacquet, he has been working with Indiana farmers to reduce chemical runoff from farmland. He is director of the Center for Earth and Environmental Science at IUPUI. Thank you all so much for being here today. It is a rare opportunity to have us all together to speak about such important matters. Let me begin with spending a few minutes with each of you to talk about your field of expertise. And let's begin with you, Professor Shaheen Atari. Thanks very much again for being here. You not only have studied the effects of environmental change, but also people's behaviors and understanding it. For many people, when they hear the terms environmental change, global warming, or climate change, they tend to tune it out. It is difficult for them to comprehend it. Now, why is that?
So as people, we have a limited amount of time and a limited amount of effort with what we can actually do. And so climate change for the longest time has been a problem for the future. So it's not that people don't believe it's happening, but it's something that might actually happen in the future. So we really need to figure out how to make people understand the impacts of climate change that are already happening today in front of us.
Are you seeing progress, or are people adjusting accordingly? Are they thinking differently about it?
It's starting to change, especially with new and exciting rules that are coming both within our state as well as across the nation, like the Green New Deal. But we have a long way to go.
Now, also with us is Jim Poyser. Jim is Executive Director of Earth Charter Indiana. And Jim, you deliver a climate reality presentation to audiences of all ages. In particular, you're connecting with the youth of Indiana on working toward a cleaner and safer environment. Talking about a climate crisis is a pretty heavy subject. You've talked about this in the past. So how do you approach it with younger audiences?
Well, it's interesting. I've really kind of transitioned away from doing these climate reality presentations for the most part. They started off as a mixture of climate science and good news from other states. Now we can talk about the good news in our own state. So I find myself doing presentations that are short on science and long on solutions. And that tends to put people, I think, in a more powerful frame of mind to actually make the kind of changes that we need to see. We were seeing some pictures there of you working with some children. What are the different projects that you are working on? Can I have my own show?
We could spend a lot of time with you
well,
talking about this.
Yeah. But the other thing I would do is bring kids on the show, because that's the other thing I do is I increasingly, when asked to speak, replace myself with a kid, because these kids are brilliant. So very briefly, we work in schools devising and implementing powerful projects like a zero waste cafeteria. I call that the sweat equity. Not only does it accomplish a real savings in terms of carbon footprint, but it also demonstrates to adults how hard kids are willing to work. The kids that kind of graduate out of that process, they actually get into municipalities to meet with elected officials to pass climate resolutions. We call them climate recovery resolutions because we want to put a kind of a positive framing on it.
All right.
And finally, we gather mayors together from around the state of Indiana to talk about this very important issue.
We're going to talk a little bit more about the detail of some of these programs as well. Jim, thank you. Janet McCabe is also with us, a former assistant administrator with the EPA and now working with IU's Environmental Resilience Institute. And Janet, you've testified many times before congressional committees on major environmental issues. What stands out in your eyes as the greatest challenge in dealing with environmental change?
Well, I think there's so many answers to that, but in terms of somebody who's spent her life in government, I think we're just seeing it's very hard to make policy these days. We are very divided as a country. We're divided about what we even agree upon as facts. And when you have those kinds of situations, you're not going to be very successful at coming together. This is a national problem, global problem, but a national problem for us. And you need people to work together, and they aren't willing to.
All right, we're going to talk a little bit more about policy later here in the program. Also with us is Professor Pierre Jacquet, who has focused on the changes affecting farmland. Of course, we know a lot about farmland here in Indiana. One of the big problems is chemical runoff from cropland, and your research has been in the lab and out in the field. What's basically the focus of your research?
Well, so I've been in the Midwest in Indiana for a number of years. Indiana is an agricultural state. And many municipalities get the water from surface sources, from streams and rivers. And farmers, they apply all type of chemicals to the farmland to be able to be productive. But as you apply, the system cannot be 100% retain all the nutrients you add in. Some will be leaving the farm. So my research is trying to work with farmers, trying to manage the land to keep more of the nutrients in the field and less getting into the water we drink.
All right, because clearly there are the consequences of that leaching into our water system, correct?
Oh, absolutely. A number of years I was working with one undergraduate students in my lab, and I told her about water can become green because of pollution. And then she did not believe me until when we get to the field, and she said, oh, that can happen.
Yeah.
And so we have seen all this.
Yes, firsthand evidence.
Yes.
All right, well, I'm going to open up the conversation now, but and check back in with you, Shaz, about the disconnect that exists in understanding environmental change. So many people see that, and we have video right now of a presentation. The first frame of it is entitled "Bringing Recycling to the Next Generation," and it states how 75% of the American waste stream is recyclable, but we only recycle about 30% of it, and you say that this video we're seeing here it kind of illustrates a disconnect?
Sure. So we actually have a lot of different types of disconnects. A lot of us, we use energy in its various forms, heating, lighting, cooling, but we have very little idea of how much energy we're using given the end-use activity. When we use water, we don't know where our water comes from or what happens once we flush the toilet. So what I have been focusing on for the past 10 or so years is really trying to understand what do people think about our most important systems, and how do you bridge these gaps in perceptions using games, using a variety of different learning tools in order to get people more connected to the environment.
Is there any particular approach that you found most effective in changing people's minds, in connecting their thinking?
So we're actually just going live this semester with an online game to teach people about the water system. It's called Waterworks. And what we found is that a variety of our own students just don't understand complex systems because a lot of our complex systems are hidden. When we turn on the light, we just expect there to be electricity. And given that we haven't gone through some serious brownouts and blackouts, the types of challenges that we're going to see down the pike are going to sort of hit us really hard. So what I'm trying to figure out is how do we get individuals and communities collectively to sort of understand and grapple with the challenges ahead.
Jim, you're also connecting with your audiences there, and you mix in a great deal of humor to help audiences understand your message on environmental change. Now, how does a bit of humor help?
Well, obviously it lightens the mood a little bit, but I think it was the way that I could actually grapple with the immensity and the horror of the facts that I was learning. So I kind of throw anything at the wall that I can in the beginning of this process 6 years ago when I started communicating publicly about this issue. I formed the world's first climate change game show called The Ain't Too Late Show.
The Ain't Too Late Show.
It's quite a lot of fun. A bumper sticker version of a climate science presentation, and just always trying to find ways. With kids are just ready to have fun. So
Because
they don't want to see somebody presenting to them, right?
Yes.
They want to interact. They want to do something fun.
And when you talk about the dire consequences of environmental change and what could be down the road, I mean, that's a heavy subject. Again, we talk a little bit about, that's kind of one of the reasons why people tune it out. But do you find that your audiences listen a little bit closer? Do they lean in to get the message a little bit better?
Well, honestly, the kids are coming to us because they're already depressed. And so what's great about that, I mean, it's terrible, don't get me wrong. What's great about that is I can say to a kid, you just met your best friends because we're gonna work on this. We're gonna solve this. But kids can't help but pay attention and be scared about what's going on.
All right.
So we're there to help them put that fear away.
I could definitely see how that connection and the camaraderie that would come from that in addressing such a big problem. Let's go back to you, Janet. Again, you spend a great deal of your time speaking to audiences as well, but about the resources available, and this is through the Environmental Resilience Institute, and how can you relate your work to everyday people looking to understand how what you are learning can impact all of us?
Yeah, well, the audiences I speak to are generally a little bit older in chronological age than Jim's, but sometimes know even less than the children do about what's going on, right? And through the Environmental Resilience Institute, which IU set up as a place to bring people from all disciplines together to develop information and provide solutions and communicate with audiences. This is what we do. We take this information out to people, and we don't have to be scary. We don't have to dwell on climate change in terms that are divisive. We're practical. Mayors, for example, and other local officials, they're dealing every day with the impacts of climate change, with flooding and heat and potholes that reappear because freezing and thawing is different and treats the asphalt differently now. And if I'm a mayor and I'm trying to decide whether I spend money on a certain thing, or do I approve for development an area of my town that is now going to be very susceptible to flooding? Those are decisions I have to make today, and I want to make them in the best way for my community long term. That's what the Environmental Resilience Institute is doing, trying to help provide mayors with the information that they need in order to make those choices.
What kind of response are you getting?
Oh, it's great. It's really great. I don't remember how many mayors there are in Indiana, but we've talked to a lot of them, and you would be surprised, I think, at some of the communities that you might think would be very conservative and perhaps resistant to these messages. They're practical people, and they also like help. So when we can come from IU and bring summer interns who are trained in sustainability issues to do a project for that community, they really appreciate it.
All right. Well, one of the projects that Professor Jacquet, you've been working on, again, has to do, we were talking about farm chemical runoff, and that runoff results in algae in our waterways. You've been working directly with farmers in the field to reduce that, and we have some video coming up of your work in the field. But what are your findings so far, and how well is your research being received?
Well, farmers, as we say, farming is a really risky business. Yeah. So farmers always want to increase the likelihood they are going to get a good crop. And sometimes there have been, there are recommendations in terms of how much fertilizer they need to apply to the field, depending on the nature of the field, depending on what they are going to grow. And, but those recommendations were based on research done in the 1960s. And those things are kind of out of date because we got new crop variety, the climate is changing, everything else.
Yes.
So we got some farmers now, they realize, for example, in the case of phosphorus, we got farmers that will tell you what is being recommended is too much in terms of phosphorus. So we work with a farmer that decided to cut the amount of phosphorus applied 3 times less than what is recommended. And that farmer is not in the business to just as a hobby, he just wants to make money.
Yes.
And he's, as far as I know, he's still in business. And we have been working with that farmer for about 13 years. And what we measure, what's coming out of his field, there is a stream running nearby his field. always the concentration of nutrients coming out of his fields always lower compared to what is in the stream. And right now, that farmer, to be able to illustrate his concept, is working with us. And we are running an experiment where we are adding different amount of fertilizer to different fields, and we are measuring that. Results show the amount of fertilizer coming out of his field is about 3 times less than what typically coming out of those fields. So you put more is going to get lost, and then you cause more water quality problem.
All right. And how do you expect the word to spread, though? I mean, if one farmer is finding, or many farmers are finding, this massive reduction in phosphorus is gaining the same results, how do you get the word out?
That particular farmer I work with, and then is part of a network, and every year, December, he will call a clinic. So he will bring farmers from different areas of the Midwest, and they will meet at his farm, and then sometimes we will go and present. We got some other colleagues from Purdue, West Lafayette coming and present, and then there will be a sharing of information. So we learn a lot from those farmers, and then hopefully they learn a few things from us. So with part of that exchange, farmers to farmers, and we expect that is going to have an impact.
All right, hopefully that rate increases and the improvement, that you see improving results. Let's talk a bit about some of the disasters that are intensified as a result of environmental change. For example, we hear a great deal about how the changing atmosphere intensifies wildfires or flooding or weather-related events. And an open question for all of you here is, are you seeing that connection in the course of your studies or your work?
We sure are, and one of the things that is good in Indiana right now is that we have a very specific study underway, the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment, which is a multi-chapter study done by Indiana scientists from universities all around Indiana that studies specifically what are the health impacts, what are the impacts on infrastructure, what are the impacts on tourism, and not every state has this kind of study being developed. That gives Hoosiers very specific information. And people in Indiana aren't helped by information about Miami or Portland, Oregon. You know, they may care about that. They may have relatives in Miami who are wading through the streets.
Yes.
But it's not really meaningful for them, and certainly doesn't provide the kind of personal motivation to work. But when we have information specifically about Indiana, that's great. And it shows it is getting hotter. So we can expect a month's worth of days over 95 degrees in the middle of the state by 2050. That's a lot. And we can expect more severe storms, more flooding. Anybody who's ever had their basement flooded knows that that is not a good day when that happens.
And I can bring up some more statistics here. There's about the growing concern. You talk about the flooding, and while the situation in Miami gets a lot of attention, we've seen some record-breaking late winter flooding, and there are predictions that half the states could see major or moderate flooding this year. More rainfall in the Midwest is a predictable consequence of a warming climate. For example, a warming atmosphere can hold more moisture, which then comes down as more rain, and this is what we see as a result. So what's your sense on how much of a difference environmental change is making, and what more can be done about it?
Well, I think it's important for people to understand that there are things that we can do about it. The institute is called the Environmental Resilience Institute, not the Environmental Sit Around and Wait For It Institute, right? And we know that changes are happening, and some will inevitably happen, but we can make those changes be less if we reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, if we start using electric transportation, if we conserve and do a lot of the things that people are talking about generally. So I think it's important for people to know we can make a difference here.
And Shah, you've looked at people who seem overwhelmed or paralyzed by this. Is that kind of paralysis, is that deepening, or are people becoming more enlightened and opening their minds up?
So that's a great question, and I'm actually going to be spending the next academic year trying to actually understand what are the stories Hoosiers tell themselves about the future. How do we understand what the future is going to look like? Is it going to be dystopic, utopic? And then how do we compress time psychologically to get people to understand and reckon with what's happening in terms of the environment? The paralysis is real, but it doesn't have to be. So it actually feeds in very well to what we just heard from Janet. There are lots of things individuals can do, but we also really need top-down regulations in order to make any type of significant action to actually address this problem. So individuals can collectively come together as communities and solve this problem as well. But we need a lot of action from a variety of different stakeholders and a variety of different levels. So it's a very Eleanor Ostrom-esque sort of view of how to solve this problem.
And Jim, in your work with the children, you talk about how they come in and they get a grasp of the dire consequences of environmental change, and there's depression. I mean, you actually see that. Once they are educated through some of the messages you're sending, do you see a difference?
Well, sure, yeah. When you give people something to do that addresses their fears, you see a real positive impact. I talk to high school kids that actually are reflecting on how much the weather has changed in their lifetime. I think they're happening very quickly. Now, when I first became executive director of Earth Charter Indiana, it was right after the 2012 drought, right? Indiana had a terrible drought in 2012. And I thought maybe we're going to toggle back and forth between drought and floods, but boy, it looks like we're in the floodgates, so to speak, in Indiana. Historic floods in South Bend, my hometown, in Goshen, down south. Every part of Indiana is suffering from floods. My cousin has a bumper sticker that says, "Mother Nature always bats last." And unfortunately, or depending on how you look at it, fortunately, it is the message that nature's sending us that is awakening people to the fact that there is something actually going on. And that includes children at this point, but it includes their parents and their grandparents as well.
All right. Janet, let's get back to the Environmental Resilience Institute and the resources that are available. What is the Institute exactly? We have a picture of the website itself, but why was it created and what is the benefit?
That is a great question, and I am so pleased to answer that. So the Institute is part of the Prepared for Environmental Change Grand Challenge, one of the Grand Challenges initiatives that President McRobbie established in celebration of the bicentennial. It is intended to bring together in a very cross-disciplinary way across the entire university, Bloomington and other campuses, every department, every school, people who are working on issues related to environmental change. So lawyers, scientists, business people, computer people, artists, who else? Media people. We all, educators, right? We all have a part to play in this. And the Environmental Institute is both a physical place and it's sort of a place in your head to know that it's going to take all these people to solve. So there are researchers doing original research on environmental change topics. There are students at the media school learning how to communicate these messages effectively and how to tell the stories about environmental change and solutions in Indiana. My work is working with local governments to try to provide tools for them. We give them interns through generous support of donors to the university. We provide a website with examples. For example, there are great stories all around the state. So the city of Goshen, we just wrote up a case study about their tree canopy project where they've counted all their trees. They know how many trees they have. Trees are good. They help. They help us not get so hot, and they help suck in carbon dioxide. We have a story from the Dunes National Lakeshore, our new national park here in Indiana. They developed a climate resilience plan up there. City of Indianapolis replaced all their streetlights. We want cities to not have to reinvent those wheels, but to learn, borrow, or steal from other cities in Indiana. Not Miami, not Portland.
Yeah.
We can do this here. Here's how much it costs. Here's who you can talk to. So it's very practical sorts of tools that we want to provide.
All right. And Professor Jacquet, you're working directly with farmers. What is their attitude about environmental change overall? For example, when you step in with some of the research and the work you're doing, are they skeptical of what you're doing, or can they appreciate the benefits that may come down the road?
Yeah, there is some skepticism, especially when you come from university. Some farmers may, in some corners, may consider you're coming from the government, and your message may not get across. So we need to work with some intermediaries. Many farmers now, they work with consultants. So if you can get those consultants educated, so you may be able to get your message to them. But mostly the most direct way is to get it from farmers to farmers. That's how we find it to be most effective in terms of passing, getting your message to them.
So that, in a way, is educating farmers about some of the advances you're seeing. Yeah. And then, Jim, going back to, again, your projects, working with kids and understanding environmental change, one of your projects is called Climate Camp. So how does Climate Camp work?
Well, kind of picking up from what we were just talking about farmers talking to farmers. In our climate camps, our counselors are 12 years old, working with kids their age and younger. So we like to have a lot of peer-to-peer and near-peer experiences. Our climate camps get kids outdoors, we eat vegan, we take field trips on mass transit or bicycles. So we really make all the connections between human behavior and climate impacts. But we always mix in civics as well, because we have two crises in Indiana, and one of them is the climate crisis, and the other is the civics crisis. And I have found great success in talking to audiences and sharing with people that we have two issues, and that depending on where they're at and where they're coming from, it can be a successful message, because even if you're not getting the climate crisis is happening, you probably see examples where citizens are not engaged with their elected officials. So I'm fond of thinking that we can solve those crises simultaneously by addressing our climate crisis.
Okay. And we were talking earlier about devising ways to get the message outside of the classroom. How do you go about doing that?
Well, kids are naturally expressive. They're artists, they're writers, and so a lot of the work that we do, we want kids to actually write a love letter to planet Earth, create some art. We had a great project at CFI 27 in Indianapolis. You may have heard about the climate strike that kids engaged in worldwide. Actually, every Friday, tens of thousands of kids strike from school to raise the alarm. But these kids at CFI, these 7th and 8th graders, decided that instead of striking school, they would actually turn the entire afternoon into a climate education event. So the 7th and 8th graders actually created all these fun games. The Wheel of Misfortune particularly tickled me. And all these great games to teach the younger kids about the climate crisis and what the solutions are. So this is the kind of thing that I would like to see. I couldn't endorse kids skipping school, because schools are the solution, but schools can only be the solution if they are climate literate schools.
So much of the work up on the stage has to do with educating groups about the consequences. Shaz, you speak to many groups about your research, and one of your studies had to do with the perception of water systems, where you asked hundreds of college students to diagram the path of how water gets to their home. And what did you find?
So a lot of our, so we had roughly 500 students at IU, at Indiana University, draw the water system, how water comes to the home and what happens once it leaves the home. Some of my favorite drawings have magic happens, and that's how water, clean water arrives at the home, and we have no idea what happens after the home. Yep. We flush it, it just disappears. Yep. And so what's really interesting there is a lot of our students don't think about wastewater and wastewater treatment, which is really important. 1 out of 5 had untreated sewage, basically going back into the natural environment, which is not great. And so, again, we have a lot of specific things that we can teach people about how we understand the natural world, how we understand the engineered world, and also what is our relationship in changing it.
We're also seeing a shift from coal-fired power plants to more renewable energy sources. There's been growth in solar panel use and wind turbines to generate power. An open question for all of you: are you encouraged by the conversion that is to those forms of power, and will it be enough?
Well, I am. I think we're just seeing renewable energy take off. Now, we need to put ourselves in context. Indiana is a coal-intensive state. We have been for many, many years. And coal has brought great economic prosperity and public health improvements and quality of life improvements to this country. There's just no question about it. And the people who have gone down into the mines to bring that coal out at great personal sacrifice deserve to be recognized for the sacrifices that they've made. But we can move on now. Coal creates millions of tons of air pollution every year. It uses millions of gallons of water. It produces coal ash, which is put into pits and ponds around the state. Indiana has more coal ash ponds than any other state in the country, and many of those have been documented to be contaminating our groundwater. So we have options. We have wind power. This is what Jim was saying before. We have options. We have wind power. We have solar power. The prices of those types of power are now competitive with natural gas, i.e. they cost about the same, and they are cheaper than coal now, not even counting all the externalities of the pollution that is going into the commons that we heard about before. So I am encouraged, but we need policies in the state that encourage that good behavior and don't discourage that good behavior. And we need people to understand that these are solutions that they can personally. I have solar panels on my house in Indianapolis. People can do this in their own lives and advocate for it.
All right. We have some questions from our audience, and we've got a couple here. Let me ask you, this kind of touches a bit on what we've already talked about, but the question is, if you could only tell Hoosiers one thing to know about environmental change, what would it be? So one thing, Jim, let me go ahead and start with you. Put you on the spot.
One thing. Yeah. Nature happens.
Say again?
Nature happens.
Nature happens.
But this is nature on steroids, right? Like you said, warmer air holds more water vapor. I tell kids this all the time. You get these 6 words down, I'm sorry, that's more than one thing. That's 6 words.
Okay.
You're going to understand climate change. And where you understand it almost every day is in the shower. The hotter the shower, the foggier the mirror. If you take a cold shower, what's the mirror look like? And there's always some kid that says, it's clear. And I'm like, what did you take a cold shower for? So I guess that's the one thing. Warmer air holds more water vapor.
All right.
It's the secret to it all.
So the one thing to know about environmental change.
It's happening, and we can solve it. We can actually work together, and we have solutions right now that will not lead to a decrease in welfare. So we have the solutions.
Okay. Janet, let me ask you.
I would say just the very same thing.
Okay.
It's happening. It will cause challenges and issues for people, but we can address it.
Okay. What's the one thing you would share?
Yeah, I would say take a look at the glaciers. No, you may not believe in the thermometer, but the ice, if it's melting, that's clearly it's warming. Mm-hmm. And what can we do? Going back to my agricultural world, depending on how farmers they manage their field, so the ground can soak more water when it rains. And then you get less water getting into the stream, less flooding downstream, and less misery for people living downstream.
Okay. And one of the other subjects we've talked on is about if we're also concerned about climate change, why do we not do more about it? Are we apathetic, just saying what we think we're supposed to say, or overwhelmed and paralyzed? What do you think about that, Shaz?
So I've spent a whole bunch of time thinking about that.
Yes.
And what we found is that they're actually 2 separate problems. One is people do not know what they can do. Even if they know that the problem is happening, it's caused by humans, we just don't know what to do about it. So in my own data, in fact, since the 1980s, when people are asked what is the single most effective thing you can do to decrease your energy use, people say turn off the lights. That's a great thing to do, please keep turning off the lights, but that's not the most effective thing you can do. There's so many other much more effective things. So the first is we need better ideas out there in the world about what people can do in order to solve this problem. And the second thing is we need to effectively motivate people. I think and this is going back to peer-to-peer communication, if I see someone else doing it, I'm much more likely to do it. So we need to start sort of, it's almost like having a variety of people, like weeds, sort of growing all over the place.
I think that's what's interesting about that too is one of the phenomenons is that when you look at climate science, when you look at the journalism about it. When you look out your own door, it's terrifying, it's horrifying. But then you look around and it's like, hey, did IU win or not? I mean, we're just looking around and nobody seems to be screaming about this, when sometimes inside myself, that's, I think, what we should be doing is screaming. So there's something about the social norm of everyone acting as if everything's okay that is a part of this too.
I think people also don't necessarily realize the immediate positive impacts that taking action can have. And I'm not talking about turning off the lights. I'm talking about shifting our energy supply. You know, you get cleaner air, you get cleaner water by employing energy efficiency. You create local jobs and training opportunities for our kids to have jobs in their communities. There's all kinds of positives that happen. And people, I hope people are increasingly understanding that, and that's part of the work that the Environmental Resilience Institute is trying to do.
Okay. Another open question has to do with, in terms of environmental change, where could we be heading if we do not reverse the course?
Well, the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment that I mentioned, which is available on the website, actually shows that, because they show what the climate will be like if we keep on the current trajectory of carbon emissions, and what the climate will be like if we moderate. And it will not be as bad. So if we're going to have a month of days over 95 degrees, that's better than 45 days a year over 95 degrees. We will have more mosquitoes and ticks bringing disease into our communities. We will have more floods. We will have more air pollution, which is exacerbated by high temperatures. So there's science out there that can help people understand the impacts that we'll see.
One of the projects we do with our climate camp is the kids learn a bit about what's projected, and then they can do a diorama. Remember the dioramas you would do in school with the little figures and whatnot? Well, they do a diorama that says it's 2030 and we solved it, and they do a diorama where it's 2030 and we didn't solve it. Now, kids do love the dystopian, as you can imagine, right? Yeah. And it's great because I realized it was like diorama or liverama.
Understood. Yes, excellent example there. Professor Jacquet, I'm wondering about what do you think? What stands out most to you when you consider the question, where could we be headed if we don't reverse the course?
Well, sometimes I think people may turn off by listening to some of the warning about what may happen. But also just to remind them in terms of where we can be heading. It's just look at 2012. That's probably a perfect situation where we are going to. So remember Indianapolis, I think most of Indiana, we got this drought. And for 4th of July, people could not even use a firework. So many communities had to cancel the fireworks show. So those are kind of important things, and people could not water the lawn, so because we got less water. So all those things, that's where we are heading if we are not taking measures to stabilize the situation.
I just wanted to add to that. I think another thing, just to make it even more concrete, is that people who have now will be able to deal with the challenges that come. But people who do not have right now, those are the ones who are going to be the most vulnerable. So the differences are actually going to increase, and that's going to lead to a huge decrease in welfare overall. And I think that we should not lose sight of that.
Another question posed is, how do you get people, from politicians to those on the street, to listen to the subject of environmental change? We've heard some examples of your programs, but how do you connect with people to get their attention?
Well, we're in an unprecedented period of time now where climate scientists worldwide are actually coming out of their, what would I call it, a scientific shell. I mean, I'm not a scientist. I'm very emotional about this issue. And you see scientists becoming emotional about it. And that to me is an indicator of the existential threat that we are under. So I'm sorry, I forgot the question.
Just how do we get people, from politicians to those on the street, to listen to the subject?
But the fear doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is like we're in this sort of weird checkmate situation where education doesn't seem to work as well as we think it would. Fear doesn't motivate people. And you know, and the humor thing just makes me feel good. I don't think it makes anyone else feel good. I don't know. What do you think?
So what I've been studying for the past, so I just received a fellowship to work on what stories change people. So I've spent the past few months asking people what stories have changed their lives, why have they changed, what's caused them to change, and I have answers like everything from the Bible to Marie Kondo has made them get rid of half their stuff. So I'm trying to figure out what are the patterns to the stories such that we can distill them into ways to motivate action on climate change. Mm-hmm. But we are creatures of stories. We love stories. But how do we use that to help people understand what's coming down the pike?
Yeah. All right. Janet, do you have any guidance
for
us?
I think, Pierre, you mentioned farmers talking to farmers. I think that children talking to children, Republicans talking to Republicans, right? And you have to make a connection. You have to be a trusted voice, because otherwise it's like, you know, the adults in the Charlie Brown, the Peanuts, wah, 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 the people don't hear what you're saying.
Yes.
You also don't need to beat people over the head with things that you think might make them uncomfortable. Talk about something else. And also, I believe that people don't want to be made to feel bad. They're not. You know, they're not. People are not bad, and they don't want to start feeling guilty. If they're feeling guilty, then they're feeling defensive. We want to empower people, let them see, oh, you know, you're a bird watcher, I'm a bird watcher. Let me tell you what's been happening at my bird feeder this year. I'm seeing so-and-so that I've never seen before. How about you? And from there, you can perhaps establish a connection and then make progress.
We've talked a little bit about what people can do at home to make a difference. For example, recycling or installing solar panels, for example. You mentioned that at your home. But what is it? Are there more options available today to do something to make a difference?
In terms of personal behavior?
What can you do at home to make a difference? Yeah.
Well, you can eat less meat. We don't have to have meat at every meal, right? You can turn your thermostat. The things that, I learned this from Shaz, the things that cause air and water to heat or cool are the most energy gobbling. So if you can be more efficient in your use of energy, wash your clothes in cold water. Makes a huge, huge difference. So people can go online and find all kinds of lists of things to do. Okay. You know, walk, ride your bike, take the bus, and advocate for public transportation in your community.
Do you find that certain suggestions that you make to children about what they can do, can they relate to that?
Well, there's things they can control and things they can't control. Okay. But what we do hope is that they go home and talk to their parents about them, right? Okay. I mean, that's the secret. Right? Is they learn this stuff and then they take it home.
Because it's their world too. Yeah. Down the road, and it's profound to think about the impact in their lives.
Here's what I'm worried about. I'm worried that stress has two impacts on the human brain. One is it reduces our ability to empathize, and two is it strengthens our primitive cortex, our amygdala, and that we're more emotional and more reactive. In a climate changed world that gets more and more chaotic, what we have to do at home and in our neighborhoods and everything else is just slow down and connect with each other. Find a way to meditate where you don't just fall asleep, because that's what happens when I meditate. Yoga. I mean, these are ancient traditions, right? But I feel like we have to recognize that our brains are going to be imperiled by the climate crisis, and that we need to take care of ourselves and understand that we can control our brains or help our brains grow in a way that is more calming to us.
And Janet, we were talking a little bit again, it's about mitigating the situation. And you were bringing up a quote from someone earlier. The quote was, "We are toast." And the question was, how toasted do we really want to be?
I think the quote was from me.
Oh, that was your quote?
Yeah, I think that was my quote. Yeah, and I mean, not to make light of what's a very, very serious situation, but it's actually not a bad metaphor because it's about heat,
Yes.
right, and drying out.
All right.
Yeah. So if you want to use that metaphor, we can be very dark toast that you really don't want to eat,
Yeah.
or we could be not quite so dark toast. So I think we need to strive towards the not so dark toast.
Could we put honey on it?
We're in the final few minutes of the program, and I wanted to make sure I check in with each of you about what's the one thing you would like those at home to take away from this program? What's the one bit of information that they should remember?
It's an emergency. We are in an emergency, even though it doesn't look like it. It looks like everything, the Game of Thrones thing happened recently. Like the last season, I don't know what people are talking about. I've never seen it, but it appears to be all that people are talking about. I guess it's probably an emergency on that show. Incidentally, there's a zombie army coming to kill people. But yeah, you know, it's how do we grapple with the idea that there's this sort of a slow motion, seemingly out there emergency that we're in? How do we marshal ourselves, I guess, to just recognize there's this huge enemy out there that we've created ourselves that we need to address.
All right. Shaz, what do you think? One last bit.
So I love our state, but I think our state needs to change. We humans are different from chimpanzees because we have consciousness. We have the ability to see where we're headed and change course. And we have this big, huge problem ahead of us that we are able to change course in, but we haven't as yet. We're trying to put our foot on the brakes, but we're not able to. And if we as Indiana can lead, other states will follow. We're not the flyover state. We can be so much more than that. We are so much more than that. And so I feel both as a Hoosier that we have this ability to change, but we need to figure out collectively how to get there.
Okay. And Janet, you've spent your career focused on the environment and now kind of harnessing all of the resources available to educate folks. But what is the takeaway that you would like viewers to have?
I'd like people to think about doing one thing differently. Start doing one thing differently. Maybe make that call to your local representative that you've never called before, who actually will pay attention if you call. And then once you do it once, it's a lot easier to do it again. Skip meet that one day and talk to people about what you're doing. But I think it's hard to do that first thing, but then once you do it, I was talking with Shaz the other day about whether switching off your lights, which is not the most useful thing to do, whether that's a gateway action that will then cause you to instantly go around and turn your washing machine to cold water. And she says sometimes, but sometimes not. So do something meaningful and then talk about it with other people and then do the next meaningful thing.
All right. That's good advice.
Yeah, I will think at probably 3 levels. Climate change is a global problem. United States, we need to show leadership. Because without the United States showing some leadership, it's going to be really hard to do that on the global scale. Shaz mentioned some of the initiatives at the state level in Indiana, things we need to do. Ultimately, I think we need to think about that on an emotional level. It's individual. I have been to places like Germany. I was really shocked to see how people is not even in the household, how people not naturally segregate waste. When you go to a train station, so you get the escalator doesn't run all the time until somebody show up to stop.
All right.
You go to a hotel, you cannot if you leave your hotel and then you get all your lights on, there is a card you need to get in so that you don't waste electricity. So I think some of those things, from education is just because of in academia, but I think really education will be the key to change individual behavior. That's how I see our path forward.
All right, we only have about a minute left. Just generally speaking, when it comes to environmental change, are we headed in the right direction? Is it your sense that we're going forward? Are we standing still or moving backward?
Well, I'm in this interesting bubble, you know. I'm very lucky I get to do this every single day of my life. And the answer is yes, you know. I mean, my wife will tell you, I'll talk to anybody about climate change. Just go to like Target or the grocery store, and it just seems like more and more people are receptive to it. Again, Mother Nature bats last, and people are seeing it.
All right. Shaz, what do you think?
I don't feel so optimistic as Jim. I feel like we have very limited time and we need so much action to get to where we need to go. So I feel like we really need a sort of a wake-up call.
All right. Janet?
Yeah, I think I'm more in Shaz's camp with my toast. And you know, I know a number of 20-somethings who have decided not to have children because they don't want to bring children into the world that's going to be. So we need to get on it.
All right. Professor Jacquet, what do you think?
We need to get on it. Yeah, it's because the climate system is already so loaded moving forward. So pretty quickly, there will be no turning back. The only thing we can do is mitigation.
All right. Well, thank you all for being here. It has been a thought-provoking conversation. I'd like to thank all of you for being part of Indiana Matters as we take a look at the important issues facing the state. We hope that those of you watching at home have learned a bit about this and hope it compels you to learn even more and take some kind of positive action in responding to these great challenges. Thanks very much to the producer of our episode, Beth Edwards. I'm your host, Bruce Kopp. Thanks for watching Indiana Matters.
Indiana Matters Environmental Change is a co-production of Indiana University Office of the Vice Provost for Research, Indiana University Media School, and WTIU, with funding by the Herald Times featuring full newspaper pages in an e-edition, available every day at heraldtimesonline.com and on your mobile device.